Should be live. Let me just take a second. Okay, yeah, we should be live now. So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our panel discussion on the crisis of art criticism. My name is Patrick Zappian, and I'm the deputy editor of Caesura. For those who may not be familiar, Caesura is a platform for art and criticism, a forum for ambitious experimentation beyond the taboos and schemas of the contemporary art world. Caesura connects cultural production in the present with the history of art to make sense of the confusion that pervades art discourse today. We publish reviews, essays, poetry, and prose, online and in print, in addition to organizing lecture series, panels, and interviews. We also send out a monthly newsletter with film and book recommendations, movie showtimes, and gallery listings for New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Tonight, I'm joined by Gareth Thomas Kay of Chicago Spleen, Troy Sherman of the Midwest Art Quarterly, and Sean Tatel of the Manhattan Art Review. I've asked them to respond to the following prompt. The crisis of art criticism, festering now since at least the 90s, has reached such a state of decomposition that it can no longer be ignored by the established players, those few remaining, who see their own raison d'etre quickly slipping away. Without funding, audience, or telos, nearly all critical writing on art has been reduced to a few lines on the artist's CV, sent out by galleries to prospective collectors as a kind of credential or stamp of approval. Recognizing the need to escape the stagnation, a new kind of publication has quietly emerged in the past couple of years, championing a return to actually critical criticism, unabashed and seemingly unhindered by the intellectual baggage of the academy, with its emphasis on identity and half-baked postmodern theory. Instead, they have tried to resurrect quality as the proper measure for the value of art, and judgment as the essential task of the critic. But if the assumptions of contemporary art discourse can no longer be counted on, what criteria can the critic rely on for judgment? Does the situation call for a return to old standards, and which? Or do we need new ways of conceptualizing the quality of art? And how to develop these? What should critics' relationships to artists look like? To the schools, residencies, programs, etc., where artists are educated? To the galleries and museums that show and invest in the work? In the long run, what is the goal of criticism? Who is its audience? What can it do? Can the crisis of criticism be overcome without changing the kind of art that is made and promoted today? Can criticism lead the way out? Each of the panelists will have 7 minutes to respond to this prompt, and then we'll follow that with a round of 3-minute responses so that they have a chance to respond to each other's opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for an audience Q&A. So with that, we'll get started with Gareth.
Thank you, Patrick. Hi, everyone. I'm Gareth Kay, Chicago Spleen. I started writing criticism years ago for a smaller publication that is somewhat still active, which was Chicago Artist Writers. And I think I kind of have to couch my own response to this prompt by contextualizing it within Chicago. At least in the last 10 years, I've been a part of the art scene there, and how a serious lack of funding, both from the academy, private interests, and larger international and national publications as well, have eschewed, putting money or any kind of critical spotlight on a lot of what's happening in the city outside of probably the Art Institute, and then occasionally the Museum of Contemporary Art, sometimes the Renaissance Society, but that's also still rather infrequent. Any kind of critical attention is kind of diverted, one because of a lack of writers living and working in Chicago, a lack of editors as well. They're very small regional, if not just municipally oriented publications, but for the most part the attention and the discourse that they generate is sparse, and it doesn't feel like it really has a lot of impact on not only the market but that's the same with everyone, no matter how big you are. But more importantly, I think on the direction that artist practices take, I think it's just incredibly easy to ignore. And so when I started Chicago Spleen about a little bit over a year ago, I think what I was able to think about was, at the end of the day, my relationship with artists, having also run an exhibition space in the city for 6 years, apparatus projects, and having worked at museums as well, the DePaul Art Museum, and the Art Fair Expo Chicago briefly as well. I was kind of able to think about the fact that there's zero negative criticism in Chicago, because Chicago's main problem is it suffers from a tremendous case of middle child syndrome. And everybody is kind of prone to an asinine boosterism to try and keep morale up, because it feels like a lot of people are under the impression that no one's looking and everyone wants the spotlight on them, of course. Egos are as big in Chicago as they are anywhere else, but most people aren't willing to admit it. And so everybody kind of pats each other on the ass and says good job, when I think there's kind of a overwhelming degree of mediocrity being promulgated in a lot of spaces, for better, in the case of young artists, because they're given the chance to show and fuck up and fail, which is great. But no one's there to tell them when they failed, and no one's there to tell younger spaces when they need to push things further and what their mistakes are. So there's this problem with self-congratulatory, inner city politics, that I think first needed to be approached in the writing. And so, kind of being a critic in Chicago, in a place where there isn't a lot of writing happening, it feels like a lot of these questions about what are the criteria for judgment, what direction do we move forward at the moment in time with, a dearth of any serious art writing or publications in general. It feels like those are questions that I'm only barely beginning to scratch the surface on right now, because I just had to start writing criticism in general. There had to be critique to begin addressing any of these questions. And with an absence of that, all those other objects of inquiry felt really moot to even start to consider. But because it's a small town, I'll start with considering the critic's relationship with artists, because if you're showing in the city, I probably know you. I probably drink with you. I've probably been to your studio before, either when I was running a gallery or, in school as well. And so there's kind of this fear, of backlash, of, burning bridges here and there, because there's a limited job pool. There certainly aren't paid jobs for writers to begin with. There certainly are very few paid jobs for curators as well. So kind of writing that, in terms of negativity, there's always a bit of fear, but for the most part, I think people are just desperate for some degree of honesty. And, I think Sean was a huge influence on my ability to even speak my mind. And so I definitely feel a great deal of debt to the project that you've been running since 2019. It's been hugely influential, I think, for a lot of people. But how we judge art moving forward, I think that's kind of the main question, is trying to develop a criteria through which to assess work. I think a critic does need their own set of criteria. I definitely don't think it can be a universal one, but I think everybody needs to have their frame through which the world and their aesthetic lenses developed and shaped and focused. And so slowly but surely, I think everybody kind of needs to go back to Kant. Unfortunately, I think we also need to approach art not as a means, but always as an ends. Each and every individual object has to be an end in and of itself, for aesthetic contemplation, for time, for experience with the viewer in that space at that moment. And I think that's also the beauty of art. It's what allows it to age. That's what allows things to be reassessed. That's what most importantly allows a critic to go back in 20 years and say, maybe I was wrong, or maybe I was right then, but I feel wrong about it now. Because I think looking at artwork as something that is complete, that is total, but then considering it not so much in the concept of, this is an object, this is a signifier signing to this statement, ideal, whatever it might be, but considering it more so as a semantic object that is dependent on place, time, context, all of those things. I think that allows us to really, really continue to assess an object's viability over history, which is useful. I definitely think all of those historical factors that are continuously evolving will shape our generation of critics, the next generation, etc. But I am worried because also, these conversations that we're having and that, I think all three of us and you folks at Caesura as well are trying to produce are happening to some greater or lesser degree in a vacuum as well. And at the end of the day, I think we can have our as much consideration and time to address these questions as we want. But at the end of the day, I think the real object is money. Because if we can't get funding to continue to produce thought, you're really not going to be able to judge or write particularly well if you haven't eaten all that much in a week. You need to pay your bills and you need to be able to keep funding these projects on the side. So trying to find a way to break through to a class that can continue to pay for criticism to exist, I think that's my big worry right now. Because I really enjoy doing what I do, but the longer I've been doing it, the more I've realized I need to get paid to do this, or I need to find other things to do. But I also don't want to be somebody's pet monkey, entertaining them with my writing as well. Like right now, I'm doing an exhibition at David Sulkin, and that's on my work as an art historian, focusing on the last 30 years of art history in Chicago through a series of collecting ephemera, oral histories, and then I think, over the next few years that will compound into a full study of the city and hopefully a critical one at that to provide lens, and a focus on things that haven't been written about and haven't had a lot of attention paid to them. And I'm able to do that because I have some financial support backing me from the gallery, which is fantastic, but that's not going to last me the full length of the project. And on top of that, it's, so much more broad and less pointed than an exhibition reviewer focusing on an individual artist's work, which I think is maybe at times a lot more valuable in the moment. I think larger historical studies of a time, a place, a movement can be good in general, but I think what artists, especially emerging artists, need right now is that kind of critical attention, one, to build and develop their practice more, because they're not going to get that from collectors, and their gallerists sure as hell aren't going to tell them the truth either. And they need that from us, because I also think there is a new generation of collectors being cultivated, especially in Chicago, as the older philanthropic vanguard dies off more and more every year. I think criticism here, at least, I can't speak for anywhere else, really needs to address a group of people who have no idea what the fuck they're talking about or what they're looking at. I think there is a tremendous influx of young people with means that need to be educated in a critical way. And hopefully, in some way, the critic might actually be able to hold some kind of sway over a collector class, an emergent one. I think that's incredibly wishful thinking on my end. However, I've seen some results, at least with my writing, and what a few younger collectors have told me that they've been looking at trying to buy, which I think is fantastic. I definitely don't think we are. I would love to see the critic be an arbiter in the market again, which is, I think, a violation of a lot of my political principles. But at the same time, I'd like to see my friends fed. I'm in bed with, the artists that I like now, obviously in a metaphorical sense, but I champion them because I believe in that work. And I do this maybe not because I'm so much a critic by nature, but because I'm devoted to the practices that I'm devoted to, and I'm appalled by the ones that I'm appalled by. And I would like to see other people. I would just hope that my practice gives other people permission to voice their concerns and their thoughts in a rigorous and contemplative way, as, practices like Sean's have to mine. I think so much right now, this is such an anemic profession that we need to feel the permission to speak and to write, and to build a discourse from the ground up with, dissonant voices and thoughts and feelings about whatever the hell is happening aesthetically and politically in the arts at the moment. And I just feel like I don't have the answers, because I feel like now that I've developed a regular critical practice, only in the last few months have I been able to begin to scratch the surface of a lot of the questions that this panel is posing. I feel like I have to completely restart my art historical education from the ground up now that I'm doing this. I'm the
Yeah.
project is named Spleen is named after Baudelaire. Paris Spleen, Chicago Spleen. Obviously, there was a book of poems and not a book of criticism. It's not the Salon of 1846, but that's obviously a cornerstone of the project. And then just starting from the beginning of criticism and trying to learn how to write again, learn how to look at art again. I think that's what every critic actually really needs to do when they get into the game, is to completely retrain their eyes outside of how school taught them. Sit down, be in a studio as often as you can with somebody else, see everything you can, write about everything you can, even if you don't publish it. Because everything just feels lazy otherwise. And I feel lazy even. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to say other than I'm scared that I might not be able to keep doing this much longer, but every atom in my body wants to continue to try and figure out what the hell is happening right now as well.
Yeah, Troy, I'm curious how you feel about this. In St. Louis, even sort of further afield from the center of the art worlds. Oh, Troy, you're muted still.
Sorry. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things to say on that point, which we can probably get into a little bit later, but I'll just preface them by saying that uh, so Mac isn't just my writing, the Midwest Art Quarterly, but a number of other people's. And well, I'm skeptical of the ecumenical nature of art writing in general. Pipe dream of the project, which is approaching 2 years old now, has been to be Midwest ecumenical. But I've pissed off a number of people who have reached out asking to write about Chicago art, because from my perspective, and I completely understand like your analysis of the situation, Garrett, in Chicago and how it feels to artists and art writers there. But from my perspective, it's like too high of a concentration of art happening and art writers in various publications for a like little scrappy thing like mine to ever break into. Which isn't to say that you're wrong at all, Gareth, but it's just that the situation here is radically and I think instructively different from the situation in places where most people who matter think about contemporary art. And from the beginning, that has been sort of the kind of like the structuring principle or like the main hypothesis of the Midwest Art Quarterly since I started it in December of 2022. Not just that criticism is sort of a good thing to do and it's interesting and I like to do it, so I will, but that on a deeper level, dealing seriously and rigorously with contemporary art from one of its peripheries could be productive for figuring out what exactly this big, sprawling global thing is, what our position as critics within it is and could be, and what the thing that comes after it might end up looking like. Mac has been going since late 2022, and since then we've published 5 editorials, all written or co-written by me, in which I've been trying, mostly failing, hopefully sometimes succeeding at developing a, theory of contemporary art that can account for the weird fact that it happens not just in places where most people see it, but also and importantly in places not just like St. Louis, where I spend half my time, but in central Illinois, where I spend the other half of my time curating, as well as like a whole range of other provincial outposts where this stuff is, forests falling in trees with nobody to hear it. That kind of strange fact of contemporary art in places like this, that it is sort of like chugging as aimlessly and directionlessly as it is anywhere else, but is also more possible to be sort of like intervened in and be clear-eyed about. And by that I mean that St. Louis and the Midwest broadly is a place where emperors seldom really have any clothes. The kind of epistemic foundation of sand on which all of the self-importance is built and kind of more maybe justifiably defended in regions that are, more known for producing and exhibiting artists and thinkers about art, is just a lot clearer and a lot easier to see here. At the same time, there's a whole host of really interesting, hardworking, vigorous, dedicated artists and art institutions in this town who at times are doing things that are striving for perhaps like a more coastal or metropolitan sensibility, and at other times, at their best, are doing things that, whether consciously or not, I think are incommensurable with or could not quite be understood as good as having artistic quality in another regional context. And that possibility, which has been an impossibility in the last 50 years of contemporary art, that possibility that something that is made in one place could be experienced as special and specific and incommensurable with anything else made in any other part of the world. We have international biennials that are showing the same art in Seoul as they are in Singapore, as they are in Senegal, as they are here in St. Louis. And the possibility that that could be different, that folks in one specific place could make art for themselves, and critics in those places could seek out models through which that art could be understood as I've said, incommensurable, specific, local, and provincial, but in a good way, is the theoretical aim of the Midwest Art Quarterly, and something that I think has grander theoretical possibilities for thinking through this moment in art's history that we find ourselves, I think, at the end of. Global contemporary art was specific to a particular historical moment that we know is on its way out. What exactly is to come next, nobody can say, but the rising provincialism, nationalism, localism on the world order would suggest that the model of understanding, experiencing, and appreciating art that has prevailed for the last half century, that of the Kunsthal, the international biennial global aesthetic commensurability, is on its way out. Thinking what exactly that means is the challenge that this little publication has taken up. And I would say is present in, maybe not microcosm, but is present in different variations in both of your two projects, as well as that of the publication Divacor that couldn't make it here today. Gareth, you're Chicago focused. Sean, you focus on art shown in this one little island. Divacor, just in a single city. That may not be for all of you deliberate, but I think that honing that specificity is important and something to think through. I'm at 8 minutes now, so I'm going to give it to Sean.
Cool. So I guess being that I'm, the normative New York City guy, and I've been doing it for uh probably 5 years and a couple weeks. I'm not exactly sure the date, but so I think I'm kind of poised to deal with the generalities rather than the specifics because New York is, the epicenter. And I my own relation to New York is, I mean, I was when I got into art, I was in Portland and then I was living in the Bay Area, and I experienced localized scenes that I think were at the very end of their rope, and everyone I knew in those scenes moved to New York. So I kind of got assimilated into New York, and now I, generally think that the only reason I'm really in New York at all is to some degree is that I couldn't write as much as I do anywhere else. And that, this is where the kind of relevant stuff happens. But that was actually kind of the first. Sorry, my windows got all messed up. Kind of my when all my friends moved to New York, I was like, oh, they went because the art's good there. The art's better, they really care, they want to make it or whatever. And then I'd ask them like, how's the art? And then everyone would be like, what are you talking about? It's not good here. But so anyway, so to me, I think, this sort of notion of like there's a crisis of criticism that has to be addressed, and it's sort of maybe coming up against a norm that's faltering or something. Basically, I think there's like I don't understand why. First way I'll put it is that I don't think there's a crisis of criticism in the sense that criticism is this is more of like a resurgence than it is a crisis. I think there's a crisis of art that is occasioning a return to criticism because the lack of sort of critical discourse and a means of sort of thinking through and considering what's actually like occurring and at stake in art, or even just a basic level of like depth or like competence in sort of approaching the terms of art that have been set up throughout history and through the 20th century to the present. Like, I don't think those foundations are respected in the way that they once were. And I think that there was maybe some theoretical, whatever postmodernist rhetoric that's led in this direction. But I think it's those assumptions have been sort of, to my mind, like obviously self-evidently proven to be faulty or lacking. And I think that's, it's in a way been sort of the source of this sort of lack of general rigor in the arts period. And so an interesting thing too is that I've been thinking about sort of leading up to this is that I've in the last month or so, I've talked to multiple people who have a sort of academic background, and they use words like connoisseurship and taste as like dirty words, or as like, oh, well, but then that's just taste. or that's just, like as if like it's a foregone conclusion that you can't use those terms and you can't speak about art in that way. And I didn't go to school for art. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, I don't know what they think is in place for an art discourse, like outside of that. I mean, as far as I understand it, like you look at, maybe like the October scene and like Rosalind Krauss and them, and they, sort of have these, appeals towards political or, psychoanalytic or like structuralist objectivity to sort of like get away from the messiness of subjectivity. But my kind of pet theory is that basically that was just like everyone hated Greenberg so much as a person that the next generation was phobic of the way he thought. And I think, he was enough of a dick that, I sympathize. But I do think that sort of there's a conflation of a guy with an overblown ego and the role of taste in art. And or I mean, I don't even like the terms connoisseurship or taste, because I think I think of these things as just like so purely sort of fundamental to the experience of art that I don't fathom how people write these things out. Like, I don't understand. My thought always goes to like, you listen to an album, do you not think about which of these songs is the best song on the album? Or like, you meet someone and do you trust them or not? Do you think they're a good person? Or, like these, I think there's like a negativity or a sort of like political retrograde value judgment attached to like judgment of art, but like judgment is so fundamental to the way I see the world. I don't really know where these things, where it's supposed to be going. And I don't think, whatever people thought in the 80s, I think those things set the ground for a lot of, um, backhanded maybe, or sort of lazy kind of like simple allegorical approaches to art that, sort of like leaning on like your press release to make your art meaningful because like your painting maybe doesn't have any impact, and that's been sort of legitimated. And so yeah, so to me, like I think, I mean, that's basically why I started doing this. Was I just talking to friends about art. I had moved to New York I moved in January of 2019. So I'd only been in New York for 9 months when I started, which is a big part of it, is that I didn't have many friendships to lose. I didn't have, any skin in the game as a sort of unknown person when I started. And then when people got to know me, I was known as the critic. So like people who'd lived in New York for 10 years, they couldn't, it would be social suicide. And, I definitely have plenty of bad blood with people, but to me, it was just like a natural reaction, like in terms of like, I know what I'd like criticism to look like. I'd like it to be, a pretty unmediated reflection of the things I think when I go into a gallery and look at art. And so I went about doing that, and it's an interesting sort of problem, like these ideas of like what are the terms of judgment or critique, and like how do you structure these things? And I mean, I guess I'm just I'm pretty like loose with it, maybe because of like a whatever autodidact kind of dilettante attitude in general. But I think, if a structure of meaning ever sort of like occurs, it sort of just happens through the act of doing criticism, and sort of like a discourse of critics, asserting one perspective versus another and sort of disagreeing, and the sort of frisson that comes from that. So that's what I've always wanted, was for more people to write, which has occurred, but not that much in New York. And what of it that is sort of caught on, like I continue to be frustrated by sort of, I'm not like accusing anyone of being like deficient or something, but just the actuality of disagreement is something that's like actually very hard to do, because it requires an opposed perspective from your own, and that opposition requires a foundation in a tradition of thought, which, as I've said, I don't really understand the sort of academic norms. And I think they are just as befuddled as I am with them. So just this thing that you can, like, it's hard to argue with people about art. And like talking to my friends, like we're generally in vague agreement on things. And like, if we do disagree, it's sort of like, I'll say, I don't like something. And then they say, well, I like the thing you don't like is the thing I like. And that's, a form of agreement. So my point in this is just the discourse is hard, in the sense also that art is hard, that like I was writing something earlier, and I just like I had a moment of like just talking about something that was good, and I was just like, yeah, the artist has an aesthetic sensibility, and they also have a technical means of articulating that sensibility, and it's precise and unique, and it succeeds. And it seems like 101 basic stuff, but like it's hard to even to begin a debate on these things. And then just the underlying of that is that, or what I was trying to get to is that a in the same way that like debating critics who diverge and have sort of competing, like, substantial articulated positions, is as hard as it is for an artist to have a precise specificity of artwork that isn't sort of falling into the contemporary art sort of morass of sort of like the same old half-baked recapitulations of everything everyone's seen before. So in that sense, it's sort of like if I have like an answer or a position on any of this, it's just that, like, hard work on these problems needs to be encouraged. And I think the art world as it functions now is built against one, recognizing that this hard work needs to be done, and two, supporting anyone working hard on it. Which turns into a very kind of like, non-answer, but I do on some level think that it's as simple as that.
Great, thank you all. Yeah, I think we should do some responses now, but I did want to take this opportunity to kind of try to shift the conversation a little bit, in the sense that I feel like up to now a lot of it is sort of about the kind of conditions for criticism that kind of exist socially or within the art world, or kind of within these different cities. But I want to get into a little bit like the kind of the situation of like the critic with the artwork and what happens there, and how how you guys think about the stakes of your writing in terms of, or in relationship to the experience of the work that you're trying to convey. And yeah, I guess also what you think criticism is meant to draw out of the work, or why do you feel that there's a need for criticism outside of what the artwork does as its own kind of thing. So I think that'll help open things up a little bit
Sure.
as well.
Should we do it same order?
Yeah, I think that would be good. Gareth, if you want to jump in, or if you've got thoughts. Oh, Gareth, you're muted still.
As as opposed to my freewheeling, inarticulate ramble earlier on in the conversation, I think I have very strong feelings about that, about what criticism is good for, what I'm trying to communicate what happens with the critic in front of the object. And I think being first and foremost a failed artist who realized he was better at writing about art than making it, I want to just communicate that experience. I think the writing criticism comes from the most basic desire to write, to communicate an experience and to share that experience in some way, which is maybe really maybe even rooted in sentimentality in some extent, but the desire to feel less alone in the power of like a really positive or really shitty aesthetic experience. I think we're aesthetic animals in as much as we are political animals. And I think criticism in a lot of ways is voicing in some civic capacity what your values are and trying to create some kind of confederacy amongst others, amongst an other, even just a singular other person, to share that sensibility and to develop and hone that sensibility with. And frequently that's the artist, frequently that's your friends, your peer group, or, it can be antagonistic as well. It can be, sometimes you feel like you're the crazy one because everyone else is loving something in a way that is completely confounding, and befuddling to yourself as a critic. And sometimes it feels phony, sometimes it feels um, contrived or almost like a conspiracy in some ways against your own intellectual or political or aesthetic values. And you kind of have to go after it in that way. But yeah, I think artists also make work in order to articulate something that they themselves aren't capable of articulating. And sometimes really good art writing, really good criticism meets them and kind of takes the baton at that point in the race. I think a lot of art longs to be written about, but not in a way that it's a crutch, but in a way that maybe helps take it further in some way, shape, or form. The best criticism I've ever read has changed my mind. And sometimes it tells me I'm wrong. It's obviously much more enjoyable when it tells me I'm right, but that happens far less frequently than I'd like to admit. Yeah, I think that's, for me, the fundamental exercise that every time I sit down to write about something, it's because I don't want to feel alone in this experience because I want to share it with someone else. It's not even so much feeling lonely, it's the desire to have a relationship with someone on the other end of the page or the screen or whatever it is. Yeah.
Well, before I get into a response, in the 80s, Donald Cuspit wrote that all artists or all critics have artist envy, like penis envy. And Adorno was a failed composer, and sometimes I lose sleep at night wondering if I could never be a good critic because I was never a failed artist. But maybe that's because I never even tried to be a failed artist. So, but no. So I think by way of answering the question, and I'm going to start my timer so I don't palaver. But by way of answering the question, I wanted to bring up something that I think is understandable in what new criticism has been written over the last few years, but is also something to take issue with and figure out where it's coming from and what it might mean to overcome it. And that is sort of like a defensive posture of a lot of criticism, with its kind of knowledge that it's coming out of the like postmodern abyss of meaning. I think there's a tendency among all three of us here, as well as the smattering of other few projects that have cropped up, to sort of reify the artworks that we're writing about, reify goodness and badness in art, as a way to just like get past the absolute fear that the last, for the most part, 50 years of art writing has had when it comes to casting judgments, and actually just like do a judgment. And at a certain point, to write about and to communicate any of our judgments, we need to do that reification. Like criticism, always, even at its best, is a sort of strategic reification about like, what a work of art is and what we've seen in it and what our experience has been. But I think that more fundamentally and more productively, no matter how much this introduces sort of like epistemic uncertainty or even like terror into the equation of criticism, what criticism isn't like accounting for a work of art, but it's creating or completing a work of art. It might be a little bit early to be nostalgic about those sorts of like abysses of meaning and postmodernism that like the last 50 years of a lot of writing, but art writing especially, has kind of reveled in. The fact that like we can't pin these things to the wall and be certain about them, that every time we say one thing about anything, there's an infinite regress in our meaning, and somebody else can say another thing and make it equally valid. That the epistemic impossibility that anything can be anything at all and not just recreate itself and turn into something else, is the thing that criticism has to take as its sort of foundational principle. Quality isn't something that like God puts in an object from on high. Even objects aren't things that God creates and then we have to account for. The whole point of the Kantianism that Gareth brought up earlier is kind of clarifying that what criticism does is, serve as a field in which not where we account for what these things are doing as sort of like sacred items, but where we create what they are and what they could be for us. Now, that's tough to account for completely in the critical situation, which has to be specific and precise and formalist. It has to be rigid and it has to be reified. But behind that is the fact that we can do loops and write a pretty, solid, convincing case as to why Raphael isn't a good painter, or why, I don't know, anything is either good or bad. There's a logic to postmodernism, a legitimacy to these slippages that are not just kind of the, onanism of some smart people 40 years ago. These are like actualities of how meaning and our relationship to objects and works of art work, that criticism needs to account for. Though at this moment, it might not be ready to do that. the defensive posture that criticism has now, I think is probably rational. Like, we do just need to convince people that they can like and dislike. So I think I'll end there.
Yeah, so I think the so I think I agree with both of you. I agree with Gareth that I think what I feel gratified by if in the in the sense that I'm ever sort of gratified by the reaction to my writing, is when I find out like an artist felt validated, or they felt that I got it right in what I said, that I sort of discerned a way of describing the work that coincided with the way the artist thinks about it, which if I'm hearing about it positively, means that I liked the work, I think. So so I think there's that sort of like connectivity, and then there's just this sort of notion that is very clear to me but very abstract to speak about, which is just the like what articulateness is in regards to talking about an artwork, and being able to sort of and that as Troy was saying, like that no one defines an artwork for all time, and the discourse around Manet or whatever is never going to stop, but that there's like a utility to the way that you write about the work, that the reader then receives something from it that makes them look at the work in a new or different or deeper way. And that's sort of the thing with my own reading habits is I had read no art criticism really before I started writing, and now I've read, I've gone back and I like Baudelaire, but like I also sometimes wonder if I actually dislike reading art criticism, period, because there's this sort of temporality of it, like going back and reading like Gary Indiana's reviews. It's like he's a good writer. I like his attitude, but it's also kind of annoying to like have to go back and like try to Google some like black and white photos of this show by an artist no one remembers. So there's I don't gain that much from it, so I much prefer reading art historians, and um because I think historians generally, ones that I like, are very eloquent and are more likely to sort of deepen your connection with whatever art they're writing about. And the strange thing, and this is something I was just thinking about, or it's not that strange, but I just finished Michael Fried's book on Manet, and I like reading Fried. I don't particularly like adore him or like adhere to his way of writing, but I think what's really interesting in him is like particularly liked his Courbet book, because like even though his analyses of like the stone breakers as Courbet's left and right hand, like I think it's like borderline paranoid schizophrenic readings of things, but nevertheless the force of the analysis that he's putting on the work makes me see Courbet more, or like his sort of problematizing of like the relationship between the artist and the work in general is clarifying and deepening for the way that I look at the work. And And so that's what I, look for. But what Troy's point was making me think about too is that I think the big problem that I like, because I'm not going to really defend writing short form reviews very strongly because I've been doing it for 5 years and I'm really not that interested in it anymore. Like it's not that gratifying. Like I've written enough reviews, like I can do the routine, but it's not very, gratifying for me anymore. I'm much more interested in sort of grappling with these sort of larger issues of sort of like the the abyss that's left by the end of postmodernism and like the sort of license that has led to like a failure to sort of hit anything on any nail on the head and sort of like what I've been sort of something I've been interested in is just you sort of look at writers or artists from like I don't know like I remember some quote from Andrea Fraser talking about how she believes that like institutional critique has as much depth as painting does. And I think time has proved that that just may not be true. It may be true in a general sense, but I think in terms of like the conservatism of the market now, uh, it's certainly, these sort of things that were very sort of like intellectually driven are not feasible anymore, like financially or like in terms of intellectual rigor at schools. Like these things aren't being taught well enough. Um, so
I
like,
think maybe can I ask real
yeah, go
quick,
ahead.
like,
Yeah, yeah.
could it be true though? I think that's the point that I was trying to make. The reifications that I was talking about are maybe like kind of like uh lowercase c conservative returns to notions of beauty, I think,
Mhm.
among us and the whole criticism thing, which, it's like a grandfather complex. Like we kill the father and we go back to what like the, guy before him was doing, Greenberg in this case. But like,
Yep.
could institutional critique be better than painting? Like, could we imagine that world? And what is the productivity for criticism now of doing that?
Yeah, I think that's an open question to me. Sort of like these things are ambiguous to me and sort of like really my thing I'm interested in dealing with now is just like, okay, well, what the hell do I think we should do? Like, what do I think artists should be doing? Because I don't know what if I know. And it's a very, very large question to sort of attempt to grapple with. I mean, the last thing is that what I will say about Fraser that makes me doubt the infinitude of institutional critique is that one piece where she's doing the talk in front of an audience and then like near the end she starts crying and she always says like in interviews that she really cries during that part and what she cries about is talking about how she lost her ability to love art, like the love of art that drove her to be an artist was sort of like smothered by, you know, Baudrillard or whatever, and like theory. So like to that extent, I do wonder if sort of over theorizing art does fundamentally kill something in art, but in a wider sense outside of the problem of Andrea Fraser herself, it's an open question to me, and it is like these larger, my only point is that these larger problems I think are like enormous. uh I don't have art historical background, so I don't feel equipped to write mammoth tomes like Michael Fried does, so I feel under equipped, but I also don't feel like there's many other people out there who are going to do it. And I think that is, I don't know, that's just what I'm more interested in right now. So
An aspect of it is the academic job market too. Folks have, and I mean, that's where most writing on art still happens, for not for better, for worse, but people need jobs and job appointments are in hyper specific things, which is good. Research should happen on anything. That's not of itself bad, but material conditions have taken us away from the big Fried style art historian or the Clark style art historian who will do the tome and who will, write a book about Giotto and then write a book about photography. So
Right.
Right. I think we should open it up to some audience Q&A. I've got a few questions myself, but I'll hold them for now. But yeah, so yeah, for those watching the live stream, feel free to put any questions in the chat, and then I'll relay them here. For the panelists, I do see one question from Wilbur Kimball, who asked, why should we take theory so seriously? Simply another way to think about work.
Well, so makes me think of a good line from Deleuze, which I think he took from Nietzsche, which is something along the lines of the purpose of philosophy is a defense against stupidity. And I think the thing about theory is not so much adhering to it or taking it as holy writ or something, but merely that it's like vital to sort of do the work if you are going to think about something with like depth and nuance. You need to grapple with other people in the past who have done it with depth and nuance. I don't think taste itself is subjectively inborn. I think it's sort of taught or learned over time, and sort of, you read a writer who resonates with you and you take their point of view along with you, and people who you don't agree with, you discard. And, I don't think that these things like taste or, I think that I think to me is a big thing that I didn't bring up earlier, is that I think this idea of subjectivity and like subjective taste, connoisseurship or whatever, is like extremely not individualized. It's very much grounded sort of in a intersubjective field. And theory is just one of the more sophisticated modes of transmitting information about art or whatever else.
I mean, I wholly agree. I think it is very much it's something you cultivate. I mean, people say, cultivate taste all the time. It's something that is accretive and continues to build and is so much more of a reflection of, one's time, influences, the people make these inquiries with. I think theory at the end of the day is better for an audience member or a viewer than it is an artist.
Oh, definitely.
In a lot of ways, it's a crutch in so many situations and has been used to prop up a lot of laziness and make excuses. I'm reading this book by translations by this mid-century French linguist, Henri Masconic, right now, who wrote about theory and practice in poetry. And his assertion was that if you don't see the theory in a work of art, it's because it's just so baked into the practice at that point. Or if you're trying to over theorize a work because you see a lack of theory, it might be that theory, insofar as it's concerned with the practice, is either anterior or posterior to the particular frame in which you are using to assess or find this work. And he kind of uses this thing where he's like, once when people say Flaubert is conservative or writing like Flaubert is conservative, he goes, you're just forgetting that it's because the frame is different. His time, it was completely radical. And the myth that there is actually radicality in art or in aesthetic production is completely mythic, because everything eventually, and I think this circles back to what you were saying about institutional critique earlier, everything is going to be captured or reified or turned into the norm by the institution at a certain point. And maybe that's the thing with institutional critique, is that institutional critique can absolutely be as deep as painting, but we need to find a new institution for it to be housed in or to critique at this point. And I think maybe it connects a little bit more with what you're doing, Troy. It's what's happening outside of the normative institutions in places where people might not be looking. And I think that kind of distance from, the hegemonic forces that are kind of dictating the terms and theories of the last 25, 30 years in contemporary art production. That's actually where that critique can come from, and I think still have some kind of an effect, because it isn't the exact same thing that we've been hearing and seeing since the 80s, or even like Orchard Gallery or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I won't add too much more, just to say that well, depending on what we mean by theory, either we like need it and nothing else, or we just like really fucking don't need it at all. Like if by theory we mean something like sociology, then like probably yeah, but it's also dangerous for critics as well as artists, because to understand your situation in a particular social and historical context is the only way you can understand anything at all. But at the same time, our experience of anything and the experience, our experience of any work of art and the experience of reality that an artist transposes into their works of art is either ahistorical or transhistorical, but at the very least, like presentist and specific and beyond not just theory or philosophy, but anything. So yeah, all that stuff we use for the accounting after the fact of experience, but experience itself is like its own thing, which nothing, theory or anything else, helps us have. It helps us understand what it is, but
yeah, it definitely doesn't help us have experiences at all.
I've got I think a somewhat related question that I want to jump in here and ask. Because in preparation for the panel, I was rereading Greenberg's Avant-Garde and Kitsch, which is a classic essay from I think 1939. But in the essay, he sort of makes the argument basically that like the emergence of an avant-garde in art was historically new in the 19th century, and that it was related to the emergence of an avant-garde in politics, namely that there was a kind of, an emergence of Marxism and socialism in the 19th century that, Greenberg thought created the conditions of possibility for an avant-garde in art, at least in the sense that it seemed to throw history into question and kind of like the permanence of like bourgeois society and bourgeois art into question. And so sort of the avant-garde for Greenberg kind of emerged like out of this kind of crisis of art in the 19th century. And so, yeah, I mean, I wondered now in the 21st century whether, that crisis of art is still, recognized in the same way. I mean, it's something that Sean, you sort of mentioned earlier, that you see the situation as not so much being a crisis of criticism, but a crisis of art. But I wonder if like the crisis of art that we're dealing with today is not a crisis of art in the sense that it was in the 19th century, but almost like a crisis in the crisis. That the crisis today seems to be like an absence of recognition that there is a crisis at all. But I guess I wonder how that kind of problematic, I guess, kind of squares with like what I see also is like a reach or a desire to sort of like find criteria that would allow one to sort of talk about like beauty today or something like that. So yeah, I guess I just wonder like how you guys think about the history or the trajectory of like modernism, and how, whether that moment still exists today or whether something really has changed, over the course of the 20th century, and the situation for art now is somehow different.
We will not have a solid grounding for critical judgment until we have a political movement that has pretenses towards changing society. In many ways, what we're doing is either jumping the gun or wish fulfillment. It's important because it's a model, but socialism is criticism and criticism is socialism, and it's all window dressing until that happens. So it doesn't look good now, but that's sort of the source of the epistemic uncertainty I was talking about earlier. There has to be some sort of anchor for this stuff that we're saying, other than that's grounded in society, that's outside of art, and we don't have it now. So I'm not. That's sort of like a blunt statement about this question, but we're still like in the morass of like epistemic uncertainty for criticism and for everything else, until we have something that could change society in a bigger way than something that changes what people think about art.
Yeah, I think I don't specifically like, on a day-to-day think of it in those terms, but I think I would agree with that. But so I guess last year I read oh no, at the beginning of the year I read Clarke's Farewell to an Idea, which is basically his big like modernism didn't work book. And it's the best thing, or most, sort of like uh sort of fruitful thing I've read in a long time, um because I think that's like really the case now, is just, the sort of we're caught in like a kind of uh logical knot of like avant-gardism as like our institutionalized traditional mode of art making, but like society's progress has sort of like apparently finally petered out, since the Industrial Revolution to now. Like the internet just kind of like whatever, Instagram on our phones kind of like is like a limit point where like we can't think anymore, and it's no longer sort of triggering novelty in the same way. And that to me, that's like really the big question that I'm interested in trying to parse out, is like, okay, so now what do you do? You know, bourgeois culture has been dead for a long time. Like modernist avant-gardism is now like fully triple down dead. Like now what do you do? And I do agree that I think, that there's truth in the idea of like, yeah, like a true like sizable, revolutionary force would fundamentally like restructure this sort of like uh, morass thing that we're stuck in. And but but like I'm not really like banking on that next week. So it's sort of like I'm interested in thinking about what it even means to try to like do something in this condition. So yeah, to answer your question, I'm very interested in the idea that this modernist sort of uh trajectory is now like obsolete. Gareth, your mic's up.
Thanks. Sorry. I mean, there's that great theory to do Kant after Duchamp, and there's that chapter, and I'm bastardizing it a little bit, but essentially, once you pick the latrine out from the window, it means everybody can be an artist, but it also means everyone can make the judgment as to what is the art. It is like the birth of everybody's a critic. It's the birth of a gripe in some ways at that point. And so at that point in time, of course, it's visual art was the furthest reach. The avant-garde was as far as visual culture and aesthetic culture can go. And now I think up until the 80s, as art began to dematerialize and began to diffuse itself into popular culture writ large, you know, uh, it starts to integrate itself into visuality and consumer culture, and it slowly starts to, hit the brakes, and everything else is catching up. And now I feel like TikTok is moving faster than contemporary art is. It's the internet is moving faster than contemporary art is. We are no longer the aesthetic forefront. And so, I fully agree. Once we have something that can actually instill meaning into people's lives in a coherent, cohesive, and materially sensible way, we're not going to change course, and nothing is really going to take the lead over what it is that we're all kind of miring through right now. But at the end of the day, does some kind of promising social overhaul need contemporary art as it exists right now at all? Definitely not. I mean, this is a hangover of a hangover. We are like we're the alcohol poisoning to postmodernism's hangover to modernism's really, really good night out. And that is a very, very disheartening thing. But I guess culture needs its stomach pumped. And then maybe whatever gets, to continue the metaphor, spat out at the end of it. Maybe that has some promise, and maybe that has some hope. I'm definitely a pessimist about it, but I will never, optimism of the will always. And that's why I think everybody here is still writing and still looking at art and still bothering to talk to people about it.
Real,
But yeah,
sorry, I thought you were done, Gareth.
I am done. I'm done.
Cool. The real big challenge for me is that it seems as though the last 50 years of, avant-garde artistic production has proven pretty definitively that the art idea, not the art idea, that, the way the art idea continues kind of sclerotically to instantiate itself in gallery shows and museum context, in all of the things that we call official art, is a really poor medium for the thing that needs to be kept alive by the art concept, which is the kind of infinite capacity for freedom that's latent in any of our subjective experiences of the world. The problem is contemporary art hasn't replaced all of those little instantiations of art with a different thing that could be a better medium for that idea of freedom in human history that capital A art sort of represents. And that's sticky because that thing is just like, a better and a different society. It's something that, the 60s folks who were trying to blend art and life and kind of get over that muddle did in their art and failed to do in society. So the loop that we've sort of been talking about is that of like the impossibility of art's ability to change the world, mixed with the fact that art is fully integrated in everything in the world, from, urinals to social relations to bananas and duct tape to paintings. That is like a theoretical mire that may be impossible to get ourselves out of without, an ontological sea change.
Well,
Sorry.
I will say one thing that is sort of my mild bit of optimism is that um, what I really kind of see as sort of the sort of structural issue, which is completely caught up with all the sort of bad structuring of society, is just that there's no support for these for like sophisticated art to be made and be supported to keep going and make money in the same way that critics like ourselves are struggling. Um, like to put it simply, I think just that if like artists had the space, to try real hard and study art for a long time and work hard at it and not be sort of run aground by either like the market or giving up or whatever else. I think talented artists do find ways to do things that, if they're not sort of reconfiguring, the burnout ontology of art, like at least do manage to do something that has like value. And which is just to say that, if people try hard and like, put in the time and effort and are like smart about it, I think good art is still fully possible. It's just that everything is built against it. Um, so
Yeah, that's late change. Our next question, sort of combining a couple um, from Abigail Busby, Abby Poos, and Max Guy. They're asking, at what point can a critic call themselves a critic? How is a critic made? And how do you judge the quality of your own work, of your own writing? What makes a good piece of criticism? And yeah, what's the difference between talking to your friends about art and actually publishing and writing criticism?
well, easy first question is, I mean, when I started, I didn't have any problem calling myself a critic because I didn't really like respect any of the existing edifices of the critic. So um I just didn't feel it was anything to achieve considering the environment. So well, but I guess a better way to put it would be though that um I don't claim any sort of authority. I've never, stated that I believe well, I mean, of course, I think my points of view are correct because that's why I'm writing them. But like, I've never like, argued some sort of like truth content to what I say. Like, I think everyone's free to disagree with me. And I think the only sort of like judge of value in that is if other people respond to it positively. If other people get something out of it or learn something or want to read more of it, then that to me is the only sort of basis for it to be um, someone to be a legitimate critic as opposed to someone who's like just writing, I guess. And I don't really know how to say like what I consider like a good work of mine. I honestly, I think it's sort of like a very sort of literal sense in which like uh my longer reviews I'm trying to say more, and the shorter ones I'm not trying to say very much. And so, the more I go into something, hopefully the more I'm articulating about sort of a wider idea. But I wouldn't even, I don't think I've in a like an objective sort of comparing myself to other writers sense, I don't really think that highly of my own writing. I don't, I think it's kind of um uh, simplistic versus what I wish it was like.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to try and like think about. I think mainly the difference between talking to your friends about art and then trying to write about art, because maybe at the end of the day you can be as vituperative with somebody you trust as you'd like, whereas on paper you have to be a lot more sober. And I think also when you talk with somebody, you know, they have their own feelings and thoughts that you're reacting against, whereas when you sit down, you know, with your pen or keyboard or whatever it is, it's just you, and you are kind of wrestling against your own ideas. You don't have anybody else to, you know, ask you those tough questions about maybe why you feel that way or how to justify those things. You can only do that to and with yourself. Um, and for me, the writing process is kind of always really regrettably excitable. You know, when I start writing a review, it's because I'm excited about something, either, you know, because I feel strongly about it in some way, shape, or form, positively, negatively, or maybe I don't even feel either way, but I felt the desire to figure out the problems that I was being faced with and then to articulate those. And I think that excitement also is my biggest problem. I wish I was a more sober writer. At least in the editing process, I try to look at the text outside of myself as much as I can. I don't have an editor, which is hard. I know my writing is like littered with grammatical and spelling mistakes, or sometimes I write and I'll like put sentences in different parts in drafts and then I'll copy and paste them into other parts, which leads to weird doubling things that after I publish, someone will text me and be like, what's the issue with this? Or something's, you know, repeating itself twice. And it's really embarrassing in a way, because talking to your friend about art, you know, maybe you are getting, that's when you're learning actually how you feel about anything, is when you have another person there. And then doing it alone, you're kind of deciding, you're making the decision, you're making that actual judgment in that moment that that actually is how you feel about something. I would never say I'm not incredibly influenced by the people I spend time with. And I'm grateful for that because they're all smarter than me, and whatnot. But yeah, I don't know. I think writing alone, it's, you really have to, I like ask yourself all the tough questions that if no one else is there and you, yeah.
That reminds me, I was going to say about the talking to your friends versus writing thing is I really think to a greater degree than than maybe other people would assume, to me, the main difference is that I care to do it, and other people would rather die than, you know, one, either write or, you know, have it be seen by the public. And then two, you know, not to contradict what you said about, you know, you learn when you're talking to your friends, but it does made me think of sort of what to me I think is the most gratifying experience for me when I'm writing is when I, in the process of writing down my thoughts about something, um, either like formulate a way of saying something that I haven't thought of before, or sort of like come to a conclusion that's like a surprise to me. And that sort of like sense of development in the thought is, I think, to me the most gratifying. But I think in like in terms of like my short form reviews, that happens very seldom.
Um, Well, me, in terms of my writing, it's bad. I think it's turgid. I was rewarded way too much, way too early on for writing like Foucault by Foucauldians in undergrad and then grad school. And, criticism has been a matter of reteaching myself how to write, honestly, and really productively, because, a good piece of criticism, whether or not it's a good piece of writing, it's just one that, says a thing. And I've been really grateful with the quarterly to have better writers than me, people who are more straightforward to like write with me and read my things and help me, put a point on that like clarity thing. But in terms of the other question, like who is a critic gets to call themselves a critic, I think that all the stuff that has been said is true, but I would also maybe reinterpret it as a problem of genre and like ask another question, which is like, why is the stuff that predominates now and that has been the, main line of art writing for the last 50 years, not criticism? And that's not to say not good. Plenty of art writing is great as writing. Sometimes it clarifies a work of art. But the way in which it is not criticism is, I think, simply that its object isn't art. We were talking about theory earlier. Frequently, I think the object of that kind of stuff is theory, or the object might be politics. The object might be any number of sort of, pet concerns besides art. But what criticism is, like really narrowly and simply, like art criticism is just dealing with something as a work of art. And we can do that with anything, like Gareth was talking about Deduve earlier, who's helpful on this point, but like a urinal can be a urinal, or you can use it as a seat. You can sit on it. You can, pour your cereal in it and use it as a bowl. And we could talk about how all of those different things like work well enough or poorly enough in their own capacities and aspects. And that would be a type of criticism, it would be bowl criticism or urinal criticism, which like may or may not be interesting, but like those are all types of criticism. But art criticism is just when you ask the question of like, how is this thing working? And is it good as art? Which is like embarrassingly narrow and small-minded and like ridiculously closed off from the things that matter in the world. But it's the only thing that constitutes art criticism, is asking like, how's this thing working as art?
Yeah, I think that's always been the sort of grounds to me is just, it's always been bizarre to me, like the people who have, a position at a magazine that's art critic, and it's like, when's the last time they, made an assertion that wasn't, PR, like to actually like to me, I think that the grounds of sort of like and I guess this is sort of an elaboration on like who is a critic, is that, or it's an elaboration on my earlier point that I think like a valid critic is someone people want to read, which is that a the content of a critique to me is the judgment on it by the writer, and therefore the content of the what a critic is sort of having a perspective that is interesting to others, of that has a depth or a breadth of knowledge that makes the writing interesting to read or enlightening or otherwise worthwhile. And it's that's specifically grounded in them, whereas I think a lot of the sort of journalistic world of art writing is very much about sort of sticking to sort of like an industry standard of the ways in which you're allowed to describe art to your audience without sort of or asserting a subjective relationship to the work.
There's a related question that I want to throw in here, that Gabriel Almeida asked in the chat, which I think, yeah, we're already sort of getting towards. So I think maybe this will just sort of help put a finer point on it. But he asks whether aesthetic experience is only subjective or whether art has a social character. And I think this also goes a little bit back to something that Gareth, mentioned in his opening remarks, which is like returning to Kant, and Kant famously sort of has an idea that judgment is something that is sort of like potentially universally valid for all people. And so, when I make an aesthetic judgment about an object, about a work of art, I make that judgment, not only for myself, but potentially for all of humanity. So yeah, I think that, how does that sort of figure into what you consider criticism, or the task of the critic?
So yeah, I think criticism or aesthetic experience is not very subjective, and to me the proof, at least in my experience, is that I can look back at or think back to the first year I was writing and I was into Cezanne and I didn't really know what abstraction was about, and then next year I like got into abstraction, and just the things that I'm engaged with are like not entirely determinate, but they are hugely influential on the way I engage with things and know how to process them and know how to think them through, and feel secure in it. And I think to me this is like to sort of get into the minutia of sort of the uncertainty of like being a critic, is that like one of the things that's most like interesting to me about someone like, or was it at the very beginning, like the most interesting thing to me about like Greenberg was the ability to sort of be like, Pollock's my guy, this one's good, this one's bad, and sort of that singularity of sort of like testing each work by whatever intangible standard he has in his head, and to sort of assert it on a case-by-case basis, because my own art education is far more of a case of like deciding I like someone and then sort of liking all their stuff, and maybe having particular things that you like, but like the actual specificity of success and failure of specific works, like specifically like when you're talking about someone who's like canonized or something, I think is very difficult, and it takes what they used to call connoisseurship and like a breadth of knowledge, and if I have any of that, I've only gained it from like reading other people and stuff, and I can't say my tastes are like inborn to myself on really any meaningful level.
I have a story that answers this question, and it's silly, but I think it's really instructive. Maybe like 6, 7 months ago, I was in Chicago with a friend of mine. We were going to a bunch of galleries, and this is a friend, Jack, who has written a lot for the Midwest Art Quarterly and has been a really important interlocutor and just like talking about all of these things. Someone with whom my taste has sort of converged over the past year and a half or so. And we went to some cafe and we got our drinks, and then he went to the bathroom, and he came out of the bathroom and he said, there are 5 Polaroid pictures, like kitschy, bad, dumb pictures on the wall. They're like pictures of flowers, but one of them I think is awesome. Go in there, like you have to go to the bathroom too. Go to the bathroom and you come out, tell me which one is the one that's like good art. And I did, and I looked at them and immediately knew which one it was. And I came out and I told him, and he was like, "Yeah, that's right. That's the good one." And is that pure subjectivity or is that intersubjectivity? Like, is that an objective thing that happened? Or is it like just my mind having contorted itself to fit his idea of what good was? At my most generous to the possibilities of criticism, it's both of them. It's that he and I formed a little, to go to the Kant thing, sensus communis between the two of us, in which something was only experienced through our own kind of, well, only accessible through our subjective experience of the thing, but was universally valid between the two of us as right. That one little thing on the wall that we both thought was good out of the art context, but we agreed it was the one that was good. That's like criticism working right there. The thing that you, especially Sean, have been talking about, like building up a sense among people of what good and bad is. It's like sandbox democracy, or like society and microcosm right there. And it's both of them, subjective and objective.
So something I'll say that should have occurred to me earlier, because I'm trying to finish a piece that's more or less on this subject. I was like working on it like all day before this, but the thing that New York has that is specific is sort of the like artist community, and within that sort of like a clout ecosystem. And I think within that community, there's a lot of sort of shared terms of judgment, and people who have been around in New York and like know what they think is cool, and like everyone kind of is like, yeah, this gallery is cool, no one cares about that gallery, like those terms create, not necessarily a absolute consensus, but they set up a sort of communal infrastructure of a way of like thinking about art. And you can just think through like whatever, like minimalism in New York, it's kind of the classic New York thing of just like there's a lot of people who like are invested in like what like cool artists are doing downtown, and it's all the other cool artists downtown who like scrutinize them and think really hard about it, and sort of you know they don't really debate in public, at least now. And but there's like a competitiveness or like a desire to achieve a certain like social standing through your work in a very abstract way that was, I think, probably more explicit in the past. But that sort of like, so that I think, like I said earlier, like the difference between me and the thing about talking to my friends is like talking to my friends is a lot like writing my criticism. It's just that I write it. It's because I think in New York, there's specifically a sort of like intense version of this sort of interplay of perspectives. And to go back to what I said like at the beginning, I think the annoying part of it is the lack of dissent and like the sort of automatic sort of consensus that has kind of emerged, at least among like the social world that I consider like my own sliver of the art world, which is just basically, I'm just throwing that in there. And I just think it's an interesting problem, especially, with regards to this notion of like what criticism is and how it works.
It's scary though that taste and fashion work so similarly.
Yeah, that's it. Is like this like cool artist is like very much like fashion. But I think that, well, I think that's the thing is I think on some level there is like a truth content to being fashionable and sort of, to being ahead of the curve and doing something right or doing something wrong in the right way that preempts the fashion of everyone else. And, just, whatever, just like go back to like Andy Warhol, John Waters, and that stuff, like this sort of the social fabric is a kind of productive element in the New York art scene, at least ideally. I don't actually know if it is now, which is kind of the point of the thing I'm writing, but it's just it's an ingredient that you don't really get outside of. I mean, people in other cities like know what's going on in New York, but it's kind of like, I mean, whatever. I'm not going to start. That started to feel grandiose. I don't want to like booster New York. It's just, well, to digress, just to not feel like I'm being arrogant. I think the thing about New York that kind of happened during like COVID and like the Times Square event and everything was just the sort of notion that New York has like a community sense was like the value of it became that it was being projected to the rest of the world, that something is happening in Times Square. But it was really most of what was happening in Times Square was that people were paying attention to what's happening in Times Square, which was not very much. And so it's just like a kind of like turning in on itself of like sort of like cultural cachet. Um, and I kind of feel like maybe that's happening on some level in the art world in New York. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting what y'all were saying about taste in fashion. I mean, if we can think of them as like concentric circles, it's like, maybe you have 100 fashionable artists, but in 25 years, I think historians will look back and say, we had these 100 people, but it was these 25 people out of this group of 100 that were actually doing the thing that influenced everyone around them or had the staying power or something. I mean, fashion is more like kind of like libidinal gentrification in some senses, where it's shaping the desires and or where our attention is. And I think attention is kind of a huge part of it. And maybe that's what the three of us attempt to do in some way, shape, or form is to redirect or divert that attention towards something that feels meaningful for whatever reasons and whatever um, has kind of shaped our own attitudes and sensibilities towards art as well. It's not, art isn't so much like arts journalism in the mask of criticism tries to present it, where like X is good because it indicates or signifies Y. It's so much more, it isn't about signification. Art is a semantic thing because, culturally, if we look at linguistics, if somebody raises their voice or dips their voice saying the exact same word, we know because of acculturation what it is they're really indicating by that. And I think taste is a very similar thing where it's just because somebody has made, you know, wispy abstract figuration, you can have two people who we can say they're painting in the exact same way, but why does this person have the it factor over this person? Why am I so much more drawn to this Polaroid of a flower as opposed to this Polaroid of a flower? It's because there's some kind of inflection that is largely in the immediate height of aesthetic reverie or experience or whatever it is, inarticulable until you come back and then you try and parse that out through, your understanding of the world with all those influences that we've both consciously and subconsciously been subject to for our entire lives. Honestly, it's like, and I love going to I love going to the museum with my dad. It's like been a steel worker for 30 years, just totally somebody who wants to hang out with me and he's willing to put himself in an uncomfortable position to look at work and feel befuddled. But he, I realized a lot of people in the art world will gripe and groan and cry about like, nobody cares about art. No one, they all think, what we do is stupid because they say their kid could do that or whatever it is. But really, at the end of the day, like most folks who are walking into an art museum aren't judging the work as good or bad. It just feels like it's so far removed from their life, they just don't give a shit. And I don't think art and art criticism, in a way, has given them any reason to give a shit other than trying to perform some kind of prescriptive moral grandstanding that art is a public or social good, which it isn't. It totally isn't. It's great, and it's great because it's superfluous in that way, to, the grind that keeps our organs, functioning, and our, it's extraneous. And I think that's the magic. And I think maybe criticism needs to do a job rescuing art from being a public good to being something that to justifying its innecessity. I think maybe that's something criticism needs to do, is to say this doesn't matter or this isn't necessary, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, that reminds me just of like a thought I probably had years before I started writing, was just, reading museum wall texts of whatever, like a Cy Twombly or something, and just like being like, God, I wouldn't care about art either if this was like how I was feeling about it. Just like,
Yeah.
and so I think, on that level, like that's where the sort of ability to sort of articulate art, just this very basic idea of like that, you read some things that make you interested in art or care about it or want to learn more or something, and there are some that don't. And I think the sort of consensus from most corners is that, the art form world does not sort of rally enthusiasm. And, and I guess so on some level, it's just like a basic question of like, can we do that? Um, and hopefully we do.
In the 70s, when Greenberg was starting to get picked on, he would always defensively in like lectures and stuff go like, you guys just overvalue art. Like that's not what it's about. Like it's not about the Vietnam War. It's not about any of this stuff. Like you guys just care too much about it. Coming from, Greenberg, one of the guys in history who cared the most about art. But yeah, there was one thing that you said, and real quick, because we're probably moving on. But Gareth, my dad's a plumber, and talking to him about aesthetics is one of my favorite things to do. Talking to him about art is great. And these people, these normal people who rightly don't give a shit about any art, contemporary art, especially. The important point is that they still do liking, just not about art and not, with the same terms in their mind. I, told my dad about Kant, and I was like, do you like what's the thing that you think is beautiful in that vein? And he was like, I think pipes. And I was like, well, no, like that's because like you like the way they look because like they are working in a certain way. And he was like, no, sometimes I just finish a job and I stare at them and I don't think about the fact that it's good plumbing. I just like the way they look, like the thing that we do through art is like a latent capacity in everybody.
Oh, absolutely.
Hey, well, we're coming up on time, unfortunately, but I have one last question from the audience that I think is a good closer. And yeah, I think we're kind of coming up to this question kind of naturally anyway, which is why write about contemporary art? If it seems to be so insubstantial or so kind of yeah, I mean, I don't know if there are other objects rather that seem to have greater substance to them or to seem more amenable to criticism, than what is being made today. Somebody in the comments mentioned like that. I think earlier when we were talking about the kind of historical dynamic of art, that someone was made a comment about that they're hearing an argument for becoming historians from the panelists. So yeah, I'm curious, like what is the reason to continue writing about contemporary art, and what do you guys think can come out of that? Or why is that the object you've chosen?
You go first.
Sure. I said it a little bit earlier, and I'll reiterate that like any kind of gallery art at this point, basically like after conceptualism or after Duchamp, as the dude would say, any kind of gallery thing is like really just a fucking piss poor medium for this idea of like freedom through the infinite bounds of our own subjective experience that art has historically been kind of the medium for. Like this stuff is horrible for doing that. The world life outside of art, like going for a walk or looking at the trees or like riding on your skateboard or anything else is better for having these experiences, but they need to be formalized so that we can talk about them. They need to come under some kind of like common rubric for analysis, guided by the idea of art as something that everybody in human history has had some sort of like access to, however limited or tangential. And it's like what Churchill said about democracy, like art is contemporary art at all, lowercase a art, is the worst way to talk about capital A art, except for all the other ways. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think well, like on some level, I do, sort of wish I was a historian or something, or I could like imagine myself enjoying that position. But it's like I think, I don't, I didn't go to grad school, and I don't think I'm amenable to academia as it is now. I don't think, I think I kind of avoided a lot of structures because I intuited or presumed that they would be constrictive in a way that was that I wouldn't have stood for. So, and that so on some level, I became a critic because I could do it independently on my own website, and the galleries were around, and I could, so on some level it's simple practicality. But I also think that while I like reading art history more than criticism, I think history, I mean, especially now, I think it's like in the sense that, art's bad now, why don't you just become a historian? It's like, well, institutions are bad now. You're not going to be a very good historian if you like learn through like the academia of today, like it, and you're not going to get published doing something worthwhile because the institutions have messed up priorities and don't support another whatever TJ Clark or Michael Fried or whoever sort of emerging. So there's that. And that's kind of what I feel towards sort of conventional arts publishing as well, which is why I did it and still do it myself mainly. But also I think that there's this, approaching history from the present means you're like doing it through the lens of the present, and like that means there's a sort of like you have to find the potentiality to redefine the past through the lens of the present, and that can be difficult. And my point was just that it doesn't seem any more optimistic to me, the idea of approaching the past in a more productive way. And the thing with contemporary art is, even though it's like often discouraging is that, I enjoy doing what I do because it's sort of gratifying to militate against what it is now and to try to, affirm that it could be otherwise and should be otherwise, and that it's, you know, the people, people should feel bad about what they're, you know, showing in their galleries and etc. And that there's a point in sort of affirming that. And it's just like a basic thing I learned like early on when I started writing. I'd like ask people I knew, like, gallerists or artists or whatever, like, oh, did you see anything good recently? And everyone was like, no, I don't go to galleries. I never see anything. And so kind of my position is that, like, I go to show, the only reason I go to shows is because I made it like a activity out of it. Like I do, it's kind of like my job to go to these galleries and write about them, which motivates me to go to the galleries because the galleries themselves don't motivate me to go there. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we're kind of looking at it backwards in some way where there's a crisis in criticism because there's been a crisis in art history. But there's a crisis in art history because there's also a crisis in criticism as well. It's like writing criticism, it's immediate. It's about the present. In most cases, it's about, contemporary art criticism in particular. Um, and so there just hasn't been enough time to write a thorough history, but there's not going to be a thoughtful history written until there's been thoughtful criticism written. And considering there's been, criticism's been belly up in the water for the last 20, 30 years, there's been pretty anemic history. You're not having institutions or big publishing houses fund serious inquiries into an artist's life or a certain time period because those aren't going to sell, but also because there's not very much written either, because that's becoming more and more anemic and more threadbare. So your sources are weak. And so why bother putting in the work when you can churn something lazy or cynical out? Or not, maybe not even lazy or cynical, but just truncated. And make your money, get your tenure, and then get ready for the next round of it. I always say that for me, the biggest disaster in popular culture of the last 100 years was the de-amateurization of the Olympics,
Mm.
because it said subconsciously to everyone that ordinary people are not allowed to do extraordinary things. Um, and I think it goes towards both history, being a historian, being a critic. You have the permission. And if you put the time and erudition and care and rigor into it, something in some way, shape, or form will come out. It's just like making art in that regard, where if you study and you apply yourself and you give yourself the room and permission to fail in that effort as well, something's going to come out at the end of the day, and there's bound to be some kind of conversation. And that kind of convivial attitude is what, propels the discourse. It's what propels dissent. Um, I love Dave Hickey. I didn't agree with 90% of the shit he said, but I love Dave Hickey. He could make me cry. His essay on Liberace, when he goes to the Liberace Museum, and he says it's the best museum in the United States. It's a rhinestone as big as the Ritz. And he's talking about the piano and the car, the gaudy car, and how drawn to it he is. And he says, it's so phony, it's so fake. But he responds by saying authenticity is something you bump into on accident when you're backing up to look at something that interests you, or something like that. And I think that is very much, that's all the permission you need to write. I don't think art is the unique or supreme arbiter of the truth or morality in any way, shape, or form. I think it's actually a pretty piss poor vessel for either of those things. But much like a rhinestone, it's going to cast a glimmer of some kind of light if you look at it from the right angle. And I think it's very important that as a critic and as a historian, or somebody who cares, to give yourself the permission and to engage in some way if you feel inclined. I do believe this is a demo. I think art writing is maybe criticism proper is one of the last vestiges of democracy that is dying with everything else in our democracy, in quotes. But it's something that people care enough to resuscitate about. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this discussion. So I believe in it because I believe in art, and I believe in, most importantly, people.
All right. Well, on that note, we can wrap up the panel, I guess. Thank you guys for joining. I think this discussion has been really great. I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll do this again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Check
think
in a year.
Very cool.
Something, yeah.
yeah, there's a lot to think about here. And yeah, I feel like we only just sort of started scratching the surface of what's going on. But yeah, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you to the audience for sticking through this. And yeah, keep in touch with what Caesura's got going on and with Midwest Art Quarterly, Chicago Spleen, and Manhattan Art Review. And have a good rest of your night.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys. Good
Thanks.
stuff.
Yeah, very nice. Thanks, all.